So my name is Brielle Pomerantz. I am the manager of community leadership at Go Public Schools West Contra Costa. I started with Go almost 9 months ago in this role. And before that, I was a teacher trainer at an ed tech company. And before that, I spent 9 years as an early childhood educator. So that's a little bit about my background. I will be facilitating today's session. And I'd like to say hello and welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight and share your knowledge and your thoughts. I'm going to let you introduce yourself. So before we dive in, panelists, if you could each please take a minute to tell us about your work, how it connects to our topic today, and how long you've served in the field of education or literacy instruction. And we'll start with you, Chanmi.
Thank you, Brielle. Hi, my name is Chanmi Chun. I currently serve as a district level literacy coach in Sunnyvale School District. And I have been in the field of education for 25 years. My journey began in Chicago in public schools, and I've been there actually the majority of my career for 17 years there, working with students from kindergarten through 8th grade. Elementary school there are all one building actually, so that's why it's all K through 8. And then I made the move to California and have served as middle school teacher for ELA, and then also currently as a literacy coach. Teaching to read and teaching students how to read is one of my passions. I love literature. I'm a bibliophile. I love my house is filled with too many books. My daughters and I share often exchange titles of what we love to read. And it's a passion of mine in terms of I believe that learning to read is like a form of social justice and equity, because it's that empowering these children to be able to access things into the world and then also just be able to learn from others' experiences about what the world is like. And so it's an amazing privilege to be able to be in a position where I can support teachers and also support children in learning how to read in my background with being a reading specialist as well.
Thank you. And Jamie.
Hello, I'm Jamie Allardyce. I'm the principal at Nystrom Elementary here in West Contra Costa. I've been at Nystrom for the last 8 years as principal, taught in the district going back to 2007, and taught briefly before that in Southern California. And I'll talk in a little bit about Nystrom's journey with teaching reading and literacy and some of the shifts we've made in a little bit, but super passionate about the work and starting to see some gains. So we're very excited about that.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And Larisha.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I am Larisha Huffman. I am the Associate Superintendent, Chief Academic Officer of West Contra Costa. Before West Contra Costa, I've been in education over 25 years, but before West Contra Costa, I served for 16 years in Oakland Unified in various roles, principal, director, network soup, etc. But most importantly in those roles and how it relates to being on the panel today was really focusing on literacy. Early literacy is one of the major goals in Oakland, and so it's instrumental in supporting my 18 schools to actually move in that direction with a focus on early literacy. And we actually saw a lot of gains during my tenure there. Full implementation of SIPs and moving away from Readers and Writers Workshop to really looking at EL education and just really the 5 skills that kids really need to build their foundational skills. And so we spent a lot of time really focusing on that. And that's some of the work that I've tried to actually bring to West Contra Costa after spending a lot of time looking at the data and realizing we really needed to spend a lot of energy on our early grades. So that's what brings me here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to turn it over to Chanmi to sort of give us an overview of the science of reading. And then we will ask our other panelists some questions, but take it away, Chanmi.
Okay. Oh no. I may need some support. It's saying that I need to allow Zoom to do this. So could you put that up for me?
Sure can. Give me one second.
Thank you, Natalie. I don't know why it's asking me to allow Zoom to do this. And actually, I taught through the pandemic, so this should be very familiar to me, but sometimes Zoom permissions don't allow me to use my skills that I learned during the pandemic as a teacher. So I apologize for the awkward Zoom silence as we transition here.
All right. All right.
Okay, thank you. And so for the intro into the science of reading, I really want to just kind of also reframe how it really is science-based reading instruction. And so there is a lot of things in the news today recently about the reading wars and whatnot. So I just wanted to clarify some things and also be able to support like the language around it, because there's a lot of things that in schools that will say that they're the way that and your child doesn't always like communicate clearly to you how they learn how to read, or how they may not be getting what they need at school. So we just want to make sure that I clarify some of these terms for you through the through what I'm sharing today. Next slide. So the science of reading is not brand new. It is actually based on decades of research, where it's that study of how the brain learns how to read. And so this is, in terms of where we are in education, we have your teachers that go to school to learn how to teach to read. And unfortunately, the way that we've been preparing teachers, and now then what the programs in which teachers have been using to teach reading, we've been needing to reshift that in our education system. And so what Larisha had shared is that there are still schools that are wanting to address that, and so that our students are not going to be what some of my colleagues call curriculum casualties. And so it is, we want to make sure that the approach in which we teach our students how to read, which is a fundamental right that the students should have, but also put in the hands the knowledge for teachers, because a parent should expect that your child will learn how to read in school. And so that should be embedded in that science of reading. And then that also informs what we call structured literacy. This is the approach in which we have explicit and what we call a systematic teaching of these components, these essential components of literacy. And there is that emphasis on foundational skills. So you may have heard about phonics being something that's brought up again. And in fact, there had been shifts in which schools and have been using in terms of how they have informed how we learned how, like, this is maybe how we should teach students how to read. So if you've been a child of the 80s, then you learned with the whole language with the Dick and Jane books when you read this pattern books, but we learned that that's not what we want to do. Ultimately, though, what we want to say in terms of the approach to reading is that the comprehension is going to be the goal of reading, because that's that thinking process that we want. In terms of all those skills that we're going to teach our kids with those foundational skills are ultimately that goal for them to be strong thinkers. So if you want to click to the next animation, thank you. So how our brains learn to read, we want our students to be something we call skilled decoders. And so one thing I want to send out is that, like, if you can do the next click, please, is that comparing what skilled decoders and weak decoders do is just basically how we're explicitly showing students what to do. So they're not on the right side. What you'll see is what weak decoders do is that if they don't know how to read this word because they're not mapping the word, and the orthographic mapping is this fancy word that we're saying in terms of the process in which we learn how to read, then they're using something like patterns of the text, or they're using pictures to help them figure out the word instead of being able to actually look at the word and be able to read it, decode it. And so if you look on the left side, that skilled decoder is actually able to look at that word and be able to map that word and decode it because they know that has that sound. And so this is where we want to make sure that we understand that and equip you with the word of understanding that orthographic mapping is one of the there's 4 processors that go along with what you do when you read, but the orthographic mapping is what's going to help your child to be able to be to have what we call the sight word explosion, where it goes from 20,000 words to like 70,000 words, and being able to map that and be able to basically train your brain to self-teach itself. Next slide. And you can go to the next one. And so also what we're talking about in terms of the 5 pillars are the components of reading. The National Reading Panel had addressed that there is these 5 concepts in which should be part of your literacy instruction. And so these categories are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. What I have here also for you, and we can put this into the slide deck into our resources for today, is a PDF of a resource where it gives you a more deeper description of the of each of these 5 pillars, because there are some things where it's like, okay, what do you mean by phonemic awareness? And what that really means is that we start with sound and then you translate to print, because that's actually how we translate. We kind of break the code. And then phonics is then when you learn what those letters represent, is then putting that all together and being able to break that code for decoding. And also included in the PDF for a resource for you to bring into schools is if you're curious about what your reading instruction looks like in your schools or your districts, is that it has some questions on like what you might be asking and looking for. So this is a resource that I was able to curate from the Right to Read project proxy of Reading Rockets. And so it gives you through phonemic awareness instruction, this is what you should be able to see. And if not, you can ask. These are the questions you can ask your teacher or the school as to what they're doing to teach my child phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So that's something that we can put in as a resource. Now, what is really hopeful and what's really exciting is that what the science of reading shows is that, I know this looks really kind of complicated, but if you just listen and what takes it is that 95% of children can learn to read if they have a structured literacy approach, 95%. And so there are going to be like 5% of kiddos that can just read effortlessly. Then there's going to be that extra group, that other layer of like learning to read is relatively easy with some broad instruction, 35%. But now we're talking about this bottom part of the ladder here, where a structured literacy approach is really essential to their learning. And so what is good instruction for 95% of us is actually great instruction for all. But what's promising is that, when I train teachers about foundational skills, I tell them that reading is not a grade level. Reading is a set of skills that can be taught and learned. And so there are folks that they may learn to read, not in elementary school, but maybe as adults. There's a wonderful, beautiful picture book that I read recently about a 90-year-old woman who never had that opportunity to learn how to read, sat herself down and made that, and she was able to learn at even 90 years old. So the capacity of it is not limited by age, but it is about the type of and quality of instruction. Next slide. So what we're talking about that instruction is that the instruction needs to be explicit. So then we're talking about how the instruction is delivered. It needs to be systematic. That means how the content is organized, and then multimodal, which is how the students experience and engage with the learning. And so when I talk about explicit instruction, is that there's time when the teacher is modeling with explicit instruction, and then there's that time for the students to have some guided practice with the teacher observing and seeing how they're doing, and then also independent practice. So then that way the teachers can also provide some corrective feedback. The systematic is that there is a specific scope and sequence in which we learn these foundational skills. It is not haphazard. So some of our programs that have just said that you're going to just get it from reading books is not going to be enough. You really want to make sure that there is an intentional scope and sequence in which the students are learning these foundational skills, especially in phonemic awareness and phonics. You need to have that strong basis of that sound, developing their understanding of the sounds of English. Or the language that they're learning, because English has, the letters of the alphabet. We know that there's 26 letters, but there's 44 sounds in the English language with multiple combinations. So they need to learn that first and make that concrete. And then if you think about it, when you're talking to your child, you're actually building some of that knowledge as well. We also want to make sure that it's multimodal. So then within what they're getting is that the students can hear, they see, but they also have finger stretching, hand motions, hands-on word building activities, sometimes with, you might see like letter tile manipulation, digital, or with actual manipulatives too. I wanted to just kind of encapsulate some of these things with some myths about what it means to learn to read, and to be able to kind of better understand the science behind reading. And so learning to read is not going to be a natural process. Humans are born to speak. And so there's many studies on linguistics where, very remote villages of folks will still develop their own language. So being able to speak is one thing, but learning to read is a complex, I'm sorry, that should say learn to read is not a natural process. That's my typo there. It is a complex human process that is not naturally occurring. So the human brain, it's not pre-wired to translate those letters into sounds. So we have to actually repurpose our brain. Our brain changes when we learn how to read. And there's actually phases in which a developing reader versus an expert reader and how our brain changes, the mapping of how we, as we develop how to read. So since we're not hardwired to read, like I mentioned earlier, reading skills must be explicitly and systematically taught. And then it has to have those ample opportunities for students to be able to practice these skills. Next slide. And there is this misnomer that like science of reading is only phonics. And that is not true. It's actually embedded within what we call the simple view of reading. And there are 5 components of reading, which we had mentioned that the National Reading Panel had addresses. So when we're talking about the simple view of reading, you see this multiplication symbol. So you're wondering like, well, how is the math there with the reading literacy? But if you look at just the top part with the word recognition, language comprehension, and reading comprehension, we said that the reading comprehension is the goal of reading. And so if you have a student who is actually a pretty good decoder, and they know how to decode. So for example, I know how to decode Korean. However, do I know what I'm reading in Korean? Actually, I do not. So so the 1 decoding times 0, my comprehension equals 0. So I may be a decoder, but I don't have that language comprehension. Now take it the other way, where you have someone who is still a developing reader. And let's say it's a child who is in California that's never seen snow before, but it's a story about snow and all the things about snow. And their background, their vocabulary, their understanding was not going to be there. That limits their reading comprehension. So 0 times 1 still equals 0. So we want to make sure we build out these 5 components with word recognition, with the phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary comprehension, and fluency is what encapsulates these components as well. And then one other thing to address is that like some folks think, well, just give the kids time. They'll learn eventually, or they'll just get exposed to it. But the research does also show that it is very rare for any child to be what we call a late bloomer. That 5% of students that have challenges, even with structured literacy, we're not even talking about students with dyslexia. We're talking about students with severe auditory and cognitive delays that have challenges learning to read. And so it's, saying that, give it some more time. Well, yes, sometimes you do, but if you notice that your child is not making that adequate progress, even with this explicit systematic instruction, that you want to be curious about what else might be happening. But if they're getting the quality instruction, I'm going to just tell you that we were just piloting for a different a foundational skills program here in my district, and just in the 4 weeks of the pilot, we actually we collected pre and post data using something called a core phonics survey. And if just the breakdown, it's like skills like being able to sound out like what we call CVC, like cat, consonant, vowel, consonant words. And the growth just in the 4 weeks alone, and we actually specifically targeted students who are multilingual learners and whatnot. They made significant growth even within the 4 weeks of instruction. And this is even without like full-blown, fully trained teachers. They were just like, they were trained, of course, for a bit, but then this was a pilot. So it was amazing that, imagine fully trained, full program implementation, what that growth could be. And so it's pretty amazing. And then just wanted to also, on the other end, is that you have these, like, some folks that might say, well, will the science of reading really kill that love and joy of reading? And this comes from the camp of balanced literacy, where, it's in my background in learning is that I was trained in my pre-service in learning about balanced literacy, is that we want to have a balanced approach. And still the goal of reading is comprehension. And you want to put in the motivation. Authentic literature in the hands of children is still a critical component. Like I said, books are windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors to be able to help students be able to to understand and bridge lives and experiences. But if you don't know how to read, then it actually impacts your motivation, your engagement, your feel that self-efficacy to even want to learn how to read. So we know that there is a unidirectional influence on how literacy skills, those strong literacy skills for addressing those 5 components, can have on enjoyment. And so when you say, like, better readers are more motivated to read because they find reading more enjoyable and engaging because they're reading more often. Now, obviously, what comes in that is also choice, giving students being able to find, texts where they feel like they feel seen, that are culturally responsive and sustaining texts, so they feel like that these experiences are important to them. But barring that, is that if they have the skills to learn how to read, that love of reading is instilled. Okay. And then this is just to say that if, they say, like, well, what about students who don't need phonics? It's actually not true. Everyone does need phonics. Everyone does need to learn how to decode the text. Some students may actually catch on and a little quicker, but everyone benefits from that systematic phonics instruction. In one of our elementary schools, actually in our pilot, was one of our most high performing schools we had. And these were students that were on our current assessments reading at above grade level, and they still had some needs in terms of some gaps in their foundational skills. And that teacher was so impressed in how the impact of that systematic explicit instruction had on their application in reading, but also in their writing as well. So hopefully we don't have to go to the next slide, but hopefully this helps to address some of the things about science-based reading instruction, and supports you with the language, that you can have conversations at your schools to better understand how to support your child at home, but also understand what they're learning in school.
Great. Thank you, Chanmi. All right, I'm going to go to Jamie now. So as the principal of Nystrom Elementary, what does it mean to implement this at a school? What were the pivots and shifts in instruction and staff training that occurred to improve literacy instruction with the science of reading? So tell us about Nystrom.
Yeah, let me see if I can share some slides and then kind of walk you through our progress here.
Great.
So like I said, I'm the principal of Nystrom. We are an elementary school here, TK through 6th, about 450 kids. And a lot of our work, particularly when we talk about early literacy, has come about the last couple of years as we're participating through the state's early literacy state block grant. And so there are 75 schools across the state. They got the dubious distinction a couple of years ago of being among the lowest performing schools. And with that came a lot of support in PD training, as well as grant funds for a couple of years. So that's really been the impetus for a lot of our work the last couple of years. And as I think about kind of taking the science of reading from sort of big picture to how do you implement it, I think there's really 4 things that we've focused on here. One is we have a very clear vision in terms of how students learn to read and why we want to focus on that. We pay a lot of attention to the data. We love our data. We have lots of good data, and that really informs a lot of what we do. We've made some curriculum shifts because we needed to be in line with how our students, what their needs were. And then finally, professional development and coaching. And so both of those have been integral into what we've done. So I'll walk through a little bit of each of these over the next couple minutes. Probably back in, I want to say 2019, our staff developed this vision for literacy. And you certainly don't need to read all of it, but the part that people really kind of get excited about is this part here, which we say, we know that reading is not a natural process. And given all this, it is our job to explicitly and systematically teach students how to read. We believe that literacy, the ability to read, write, and understand, is a civil right. And so I think oftentimes people read that and get very motivated by that last sentence, which has been a real anchor for our staff. We've used this a lot in staff meetings and in PDs. We've used this itself as a language dive that we've done with our staff. But that sentence before that, there's a lot in there that I think is really powerful that talks about how we teach kids to read. So like was mentioned earlier, that reading is not a natural process. Like we're stating that up front. And then the systematic and explicit instruction. So being able to name that, and like I said, this was developed 3 or 4 years ago at this point, and we keep coming back to it as a staff because it is really the anchor for our work. And then I mentioned that we love our data, and we have lots of spreadsheets and different ways to look at it. But over my time here, my 8 years at Nystrom, we have collected so many different early literacy data points over the years, and they haven't been aligned and they haven't necessarily been helpful. And so we made the shift to DIBELS several years ago. And the reason was we needed an assessment that was valid, predictive, reliable, all of those things, which it is. It's free. So any school leader loves hearing it's free. And it's quick to administer. There's a number of subtests, but they're 1 minute each. So you can get a lot of information quickly. And one of the things I love about it is that it provides me as a leader, both like grade level information, school-wide information, but then there's enough data there for our teachers to really drill down and look at the data. So I'll give a couple of examples. This is one way in which I can look at it with our team of teachers or our staff. And so this is looking at a cohort of kids. They're now in 2nd grade, but if you look at the beginning of 1st grade, they had distance learning for kindergarten and came back last fall in 1st grade, and 86% of our 1st graders were in the red, meaning they needed intensive intervention in 1st grade. And that's terrifying to see. And you can see how we chipped away at that over the last year and a half. And we obviously still have a long ways to go. But over the last year and a half, we've gone from 86% to 46% in the red, needing intensive intervention. And right now, this week, we're collecting end of the year DIBELS. So if you ask me in a week, I could give you an updated graph. But that's a great sign of progress that, what our teachers are doing with our kids is making significant progress. And then if we drill down to a student level, so here's a 3rd grader. And what I love about this is you can see the student's progress over the last year and a half. And so he came back 2nd grade, beginning of last year. And one of the big measures in DIBELS is oral reading fluency. And he was reading 2 words per minute and 29% accuracy. So really was essentially a non-reader. And if we were to just look at his composite scores over his 2nd grade year, we would see growth, but he's still really in the red. And so I think oftentimes we kind of stay in that big picture level and just focus on the composite score. But what we were able to do, because the subtests and DIBELS can be really helpful, is if you drill down to different subtests, you can see early indicators of progress. And so one example of that is his oral reading fluency. the accuracy. So before a student can read fluently, they have to be able to read accurately. They have to be able to decode. And so while this student did not necessarily jump the band, he didn't go from red to yellow to green over the course of second grade. But there's some really hopeful progress here when he went from 29% accuracy to 52% accuracy. And by the end of the year, 100% accuracy. And that was really an indicator to us that, like, okay, he is on the right track, which was really exciting. And then if we click forward to this year, you see once he had that accuracy, he really took off. So beginning of the year, he came back. His composite score was no longer in the red. It was in the yellow, which is improvement. You do see the slight dip in his accuracy, but you see by the middle of the year, it really took off. And by the middle of the year, he was reading 107 words per minute, which puts him on grade level. And so, like, we look at lots of data, we look at lots of spreadsheets and lots of colors, but when you think about a third grader who started just a year and a half ago reading 2 words a minute and is now here at this point in the middle of third grade reading 107 words per minute, like, we've changed his academic trajectory in that time, and that's a really powerful thing. He can now read, he can now access grade level text. So that's an example of how we use data both at sort of the granular level with specific student level data, as well as teacher and grade level data. The other big shift that we made over the years was away from certain curriculums. So I think 2019, our district adopted units of study, we have never used it here at Nystrom. You can see our book room there. We still have a lot of it in boxes. But we adopted a curriculum at that same time. Just a handful of sites kind of went through that. And we have since then made some adjustments in our curriculum just for foundational skills. Because as we kind of went through these questions, what we were using didn't meet all of our needs. And so, does it meet all the components of Scarborough's rope? And I'll show you that in a moment. Is it taught consistently in classrooms? I think if I were to back up 6, 7, 8 years ago when I started here, we had a lot of different things happening in classrooms, different assessments, different curriculums, different approaches, and there was no alignment. And so now we can confidently say that, like, we are aligned in what we're doing from classroom to classroom, and that's made all of the difference. And so I'll click forward. When we talk about Scarborough's rope, very similar to the simple view of reading. We use this graphic a lot. It's just visually more appealing to me than the simple view, but very similar. But word recognition, that's really those foundational skills. And so several years ago, we shifted away from the curriculum we were using for foundational skills because it wasn't explicit or systematic enough. And so we did that. We do use EL for language comprehension. We don't use all components of EL. And then this year, we have noticed that when our students were exiting SIPs, they had shown mastery of foundational skills, but we're still struggling on fluency. When we looked at our oral reading fluency data, it was not where we would want it to be. So we layered on another quick practice. It's called Quick Reads, but basically to give students more time and practice to implement those decoding skills that they have learned in foundational skills. And so all of that hopefully brings together a skilled reader, and that's sort of the approach that we have taken and have adapted over the years as well. The last thing that we have done is put a lot of effort into professional development and coaching. And so we have had a lot of professional development through outside support and organizations to support us in implementing our curriculums, and making sure that the professional development is based on what the data tells us. So using that to guide guide our PD. We've also done a ton of site-based PD over the last couple of years, really leveraging our literacy coach and her expertise to roll out the shifts we've made. I will say I taught fourth grade for a very long time. Definitely did not know how to teach a child to read. So if a teacher or if a kid came to me 15 years ago when I was a teacher, I did not have the skills to do that, to help them catch up. But over the last couple of years, I have learned a lot. And so like just being a part of those PDs, jumping into classrooms and being able to really be an instructional leader in that way. So we do lots of coaching, lots of PD at our site. And I think without any of these four pieces, our reading instruction would not be where it is today. So that's a little bit about quick deep dive into Niestrom's last couple of years.
Thank you, Jamie. And then we're going to turn to Larisha, someone who works in the district on the district level. So can you speak about how this, maybe the model of science of reading could be scaled district-wide? What levers need to be in place to make this successful on a district scale to improve literacy instruction in all schools?
Thank you. I also prepared a little slide deck just so I have something to read from.
Great.
Slideshow. Can everybody see my screen? Okay. So upon arriving in West Contra Costa, some of the things I did was kind of just look at the history of where West Contra Costa was in terms of literacy. And as Jamie talked about, in 2020, there was a Teachers College Readers and Writers Workshop, which is actually still in place. And then also in place in 2021. And so when I started in 21-22, after looking at some of the data between these years, we opted to do a pilot of SIPs, to have SIPs in place at school sites. So SIPs was purchased for all schools in West Contra Costa. So as we're thinking about scaling success, this was one of the first things that was done to support that. And then 2022, 23, we also then piloted iReady. And then also we still have STAR Early Literacy. And then we also added ESGI because we also did not have a strong assessment for our, we were using, there was FMP, but teachers were keeping the data on Google Docs and things like that. And so we actually didn't have a way as a system to see how our students were doing in the early grades. And so one of the goals was to implement something where we could see how our early grades were doing. And so we implemented ESGI. So that is what is used. And then, just a little bit of background. It's sort of our thinking and things that we've been working on in Ed Services was really, this is just a statement that West Contra Costa will begin to develop a clearly articulated vision for literacy. That will support our educators to hold a shared understanding of research-based effective literacy instruction to ensure our students experience success in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Also, the foundation of this vision is really around an emphasis on rigorous standards-based instruction, complex text, and the 5 pillars of early literacy, which we've heard a lot about: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, as well as really looking at the alignment of those assessments to include screeners, diagnostics, formative, and summative assessments. As West Contra Costa develops their vision, they will continue to engage stakeholders around alignment of the vision and the current adopted curriculum and supplemental materials. This alignment will be crucial in guiding our future literacy adoptions and professional development structures for our teachers and leaders. So some things that are currently happening centrally, we've done a lot of data collection in 2020, 22, 23. So really understanding our current reality. We've done, the literacy department has done learning walks at school sites. They've done listening sessions with leaders and teachers, families, and data analysis and research review as we're preparing for some changes in the future. 22, 23, the plan is to have a literacy task force They want to identify key stakeholders to develop and finalize a literacy vision and framework, make clear recommendations for adjustments, alignments, and professional development. And then in 24-25, prioritize actions. We want to move to another literacy adoption, a recommendation for K-6 based on California ELA and ELD framework, because a big concern has also been that our curriculum is not also supporting our ELD students. And so that is also something that we really need to look at. And then a clearly articulated, aligned instructional focus, scope and sequence, assessment, and professional learning. That's the plan moving forward. And some of the things that are happening now to kind of fill in the gaps, moving with a sense of urgency while ensuring buy-in and engagement. So we already know that something needs to change. But obviously, this is a very large, complex system with 54 schools, 54 different principals. And so we're kind of doing gap filling while also trying to move forward and make those shifts towards a more science of reading approach. So we have SIPS curriculum to ensure all students have access to research-based foundational skills program, organizational literacy goals that we've shared to clearly communicate and align goal setting. We developed an instructional focus plan to identify core instructional practices. We've done a lot of professional development to build capacity and knowledge base. So we've sent tons of teachers through the help of Chamberlain Foundation to Standards Institute. We have SIPS training every month for teachers. We also do a lot of work on complex text as well. We offer trainings monthly for teachers and principals. We also have, we're currently in an assessment review and pilot of iReady to ensure that it really meets our goals around seeing where our students are academically, to ensure alignment, progress monitoring, and consistency, because we also want to ensure that we provide teachers with a platform where they can also progress monitor students. And then tiered supports for focal students. So we've also put in a lot of tiered supports as well. So some of our next steps are really the literacy department is going to be presenting a scope and sequence and action plan to the board, leaders, teachers, and community. There's going to be ongoing engagement and feedback of stakeholders. There's going to be a formation of a literacy task force. And then we're going to continue to mediate stopgaps to meet our student needs to move towards some changes. And that is where we are.
Thank you, Larisha.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you all of our panelists for those great presentations. I know I'm learning a lot along with everyone else here today. So we'll move into some preset questions that'll touch upon maybe some of the things we talked about, but that are a little more specific. So let's say a school or district has decided that they're shifting to their instruction to apply the science of reading principles. What would look different for staff, and what would look different for families and students? And we'll start with you, Jamie.
What would look different? I think the instruction itself looks very different. It's very like our instruction right now is much more, for lack of a better term, explicit and systematic. It's heavily based on routines, and so our teachers as well as our students know those routines. I think for families, the biggest thing is, and we have a lot of work to do at our site with this, but we have so much data that we have collected over the last 2 years. And so how do we bring families into that to let them know where their student is at and involve them in the process more? I think that's really a next step for us, is making sure that families see that data and can understand the data. So I think those are two big ways.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that from our other two panelists?
Could you do me a favor and repeat the question one more time?
Yes, of course. So let's say a school or a district is shifting to apply the science of reading principles that we've outlined today. What might look different for staff, and what would look different for families and students?
Yeah, I mean, I would just piggyback off what Jamie said. I think that thinking about shifting to the science of reading, you're going to see more structure in the classroom. I also think you're going to see more data. You're going to know specifically the needs of your student, the needs of your child. I think for teachers, it's also going to provide a lot more routine and a lot more data as well. I also think that I think it's important for families to know that science of reading, and I think someone said this, that it's not taking away from literature or the love of reading, because you might have some parents who are going to be cautionary, you know, like, well, wait a minute, my child is not going to have a novel in their hand, or they're not going to have print rich books in front of them every day. And so I think it's important for parents to understand that there's a balance that has to happen, and that foundational skills are absolutely necessary. And I think once you start applying that and showing parents, and parents are actually able to see the growth in their students, then that's where you're going to have the success, right? Because you're going to actually see that your child is growing, and you're going to be less sort of apprehensive about the fact that you may feel that they might not have a novel in front of them every single day trying to grapple with text, right? And so I think it's also important for teachers. You know, I think it's going to require also for teachers a lot more professional development, because if this were West Contra Costa, it's going to require you to completely rethink in some instances how you're actually teaching reading. And so it's going to require a different mindset shift. And so any district that's adopting, or any school that's making a shift, there has to be strong professional development and a strong professional development plan that's put in place for teachers.
Great, thank you.
And if I can add that, like,
yeah,
what
go ahead.
differences that you'll see though is, I mean, just even from our program, like the curriculum, the program shifts that we're trying to make in our district, is that teachers, just like Jamie had mentioned, is that some teachers just didn't feel like they knew how to teach students how to read. So with the correct training, the proper training, as well as the proper curriculum, you're equipping teachers to know how to do this well as then the students are learning, and the children are able to like say, hey, that's a double trouble word. This is like a newcomer who with, this is it speaks volumes that the child who was quiet in the class and didn't feel like they had access to the code of learning how to read, all of a sudden knows what that code is and is able to articulate. And so like they were kind of quiet in terms of the participation before, but then after being equipped with this, the beginning of this knowledge, students were raising their hands. Students were like pointing out, hey, when you read, that's a double trouble word. So you should actually be able to hear your child be able to name things like those different things I said in the choreophonic service. They're like, hey, I know that rule. I know how to apply that when I read, and I know how to use that when I write. And so you'll see that that approach, but also with teachers just knowing like, hey, now I know if this is how I teach, and this is the scope and sequence in which I teach my students, and then having that capability and capacity is what's also going to shift for schools.
The other thing I would just add is if a student is in need of intervention, and we see that, it's our responsibility as a school or as a district to provide them the support that they need. It's not oh, well, they'll get it eventually. We need to make sure that we have interventions that are aligned, so our tier 1, tier 2 supports are in place, and ideally what they get in the classroom tier 1 is aligned to what they get in tier 2. And I think oftentimes there isn't alignment there.
Great. For Larisha, what can families do to help advocate for the transition to this style of instruction? So what can families do if they're seeing that these things are working, or this is the best way to do this? How can they advocate?
I mean, some ways that parents have been advocating currently are sending me emails, so I've had parents sending me several emails just saying, my child is at X school and they're using X curriculum. My child is still not able to read, or my child is still a struggling reader. Those emails have gone to me and the superintendent. And I think there is already a sense of urgency or a belief that we need to do something different. I think, as with anything, as I've said before, in a large, complex system, it requires change management, right? And so I would just encourage parents to, come to board meetings, to continue to email, continue to advocate, having conversations with their principals, having conversations with their child's teacher. I know for myself, when as a parent, before Oakland, my daughter is in Oakland Unified, but before they made the shift, I had already started talking to the principal of my daughter's school saying, I think we need to look at, thinking about some things differently, right? She really needs support with foundational skills. And so they actually started making the shift themselves. Based on my conversation with the teacher, she started having these after school groups that were really trying to build foundational skills. But as Jamie said, you shouldn't be doing it in isolation of what's happening in tier 1 and tier 2. And that's still what was happening. It was building some capacity, but not at the level it could have if there was clear alignment between the classroom day and those interventions, core instruction and those interventions. But advocating to your child's teacher, advocating to the principal, and definitely advocating at the school district level as well, I think will help change some of those shifts. And then as the literacy task force starts to form, being a part of that. So parents who really want to advocate, being a part of that task force so they can also have a voice in the shift and changing the curriculum in West Contra Costa.
Great, thank you.
And it is very fair for a parent to, for a parent to expect, hey, why isn't my child learning to read in school? And so I love the Nystrom vision for literacy is that it is the right to read. It is a fundamental right for students to learn to read, and also our fundamental responsibility as teachers and schools to teach our students how to read. And so I am putting into the chat the guide that I had in my slide deck, because it has a guide for questions you can ask your teacher if you're wondering about what's happening in the classroom, some encouraging signs, and then some signs that maybe the instruction isn't what you want it to be in terms of proper instruction for reading. So, I feel free to ask any questions if you have anything, but that should, and that's in the 5 different pillars, the 5 different components as well. So if you're wondering about phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, fluency, those are the different sections, and they're delineated in terms of like what you can ask. Because I think part of the thing is that as schools, and teachers, administrators, we use these terms like tier 1, tier 2, and parents, they may not have that language, that understanding of like, what are these specific terms? It's almost like going to law school or that specific jargon. So we want to make sure you understand that like tier 1 means that, it's the classroom instruction. Your child should learn how to read. Everyone gets those foundational skills. Everyone gets that explicit systematic instruction in to learn how to read with those 5 pillars. And then with tier 2, it's that small group where if you do have, the teacher can address any specific needs after assessing and knowing where your child is at and what they need, their strengths, and knowing where they need is where the tier 2 instruction can be.
Great. Are there any limitations to this theoretical approach? Chani, why don't you kick us off with that?
I think right now there's actually, it's a funny question. I think it's more of just the word science has come under fire. I'll just say that. And so let's take that back, and let's say in terms of the science of reading, and just say this is what we have known actually more than, like, this isn't just the last couple of years. I know that a lot of schools are catching up to be able to address this instruction properly with the proper teacher training. Even colleges are rethinking how they need to teach teachers how to teach reading. And so there are programs that still don't teach with science-based instruction. And so it's going to take time. And I think part of that is then let's look at, like, we now know how we can actually look in the brain and know how we're supposed to learn how to read. And that's how we're designing our instruction. So this is not John Mee's way of teaching how to read. This is not West Contra Costa. This is actually what science tells us of how children learn how to read. And so I think barring that, and then also that misunderstanding of like balanced literacy camp, which in terms of like the authentic literature, then your child will learn how to read. But you can put a book in front of a child, but they may not, and you're going to have a rich literacy experience. You're going to build background knowledge. You're going to have a shared reading experience. You want authentic choice, but that won't teach a child how to read. And so that, in terms of like that systematic, explicit instruction is a really critical component to that theory behind the science-based reading instruction that we want to really emphasize. And so I think really like, let's get past to like, you know, in terms of the approach, there's actually, if you, there's a podcast that actually encapsulates a lot of this. If parents are, there's a lot of podcasts for science of reading, but Emily Hanford Sold a Story is actually a really, the quality of reporting. She's an education reporter that really has the voices of all of why this might not be in the schools and why districts are still, you know, making these plans like Larisha had shared with like West Contra Costa Unified plans for, you know, making this PIP, but we have to say like, it's still hopeful. Like we can still make this movement forward. We can still do this for our children and do right by our students, but also recognize that it's not first of all, as parents, it's not your child's fault. Okay. And it should be that like, we really address this and push that. What will your school do? What will your teacher do? And if the teacher doesn't have that knowledge yet, it's not too late, and that it can be addressed. But the teacher then has to be supported by administrators like Jamie at his site, you know, that want to have this shift, and district leaders like Larisha that are going to make this movement forward. So it's possible, but I think there isn't any flaw in the research because it's like, I mean, there are actual videos to show like how your brain lights up, and it's actually a fast. I mean, I'm a brain research nerd as well, and it just is fascinating to see how the brain it's so complicated, but like your brain is lighting up if it knows how to read, and it's not even predictable sometimes in terms of like what might light up because of how you engage with text. And so that's what we want for our children. That's what we want, is that being equipped to be able to have, you know, empower them to be able to like have access and entry to the world, but also to be able to express themselves as well. So this is why it's important. And, you know, it's really like, let's get that messaging out there that let's not fight about the semantics. Let's get to actually teaching those kids how to read.
And in that vein, to Jamie, how does the science of reading support the instruction of English learners? Do you have experience with this at Nystrom? I'm guessing you do. So can you speak to that?
So about 2/3 of our students are English learners. And I think just to like English learners, newcomers can learn, particularly the phonics. Some of those students have picked it up so fast with our foundational skills. They can do it. And I think, I actually think, kind of piggybacking on the last question, one of the challenges, I think when we talk about reading instruction and we talk about foundational skills or the word recognition part of Scarborough's rope and the language comprehension, nailing or getting right the language comprehension is far more difficult than the decoding part. We really know like how to teach kids phonics. We just don't universally do it well. We know how to do the foundational skills. Teaching kids how to read, how to write, how to use those language skills, how to understand what they're reading is a much more complicated process. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges as we kind of move forward, is figuring out how do we support, particularly our English learners are our biggest subgroup at Nystrom. So how do we support them in those developing those language comprehension skills?
And we touched on this with tier 1 and tier 2 and talking about differentiated instruction, but sort of just to touch on it, how does a science of reading approach support the learning of children maybe with special needs or neurodiverse learners? Anyone want to chime in on that?
I'll jump in quickly. I think something that our literacy coach talks a lot about is dosage. And so students who have an IEP or are struggling don't necessarily need something different. They need more. So they need a higher dosage, maybe another chance at that lesson. But the more dosage they get, we have students who with that have seen gains. And so an example of that would be for our foundational skills model. We have kids that'll go to a different classroom for their reading instruction. And then they can get a second dose with another teacher. So they can get basically the same lesson twice. And very few kids need that. But there are a handful of kids that that's been really beneficial for. So we talk a lot about dosage rather than needing something different.
Great.
And
Awesome.
actually learning how to read. Sorry, this is one of my big things that just like, it's very fresh in my brain because I do train teachers on foundational skills. And what's fascinating is that as we become more skilled readers, we read something called, I'm going to get a little literacy nerdy, but multisyllabic words. That means that words with that high academic terms. So like words like Wisconsin, transatlantic, those words are multisyllabic words. That the students will start to encounter even in second grade, but definitely with the more complex texts in the older grades in upper elementary and through middle school and high school. And for English language learners, 50% of our language for multisyllabic words are what we call closed syllables. So we're teaching these systematic explicit phonics instruction and foundational skills. You're equipping your multilingual learners to know how to break the code of English just by saying like, this is a closed syllable and this is a cluster of small closed syllables, and you can apply it to any academic multisyllabic word. So, yes, more dose, like a double dosing is what we kind of say in education world of instruction, or actually designated ELD instruction can also include foundational skills, because that is one of the third elements of ELD instruction here in California, is that foundational skills is also addressed. Make sure that if you have another language that's a first language that's spoken at home that's other than English, continue to develop those sounds in that language is what's going to help your language transfer, because a lot of languages are sound based as well. And so even if it's Spanish, of course, is very easy to to have those cognates. But even if it's like a different foreign language like Korean or Chinese, if they have the sound, like Korean is a very phonetic language, to get the sound, they can translate that into English. And now they just have to know that symbol matches this. So, the science-based reading instruction with the explicit instruction, especially those multilinguals, will really benefit from that, as well as all learners as well.
Great. Thank you. That is all for our preset questions. If you do have questions in the audience, please type them into the Q&A section, and they can be read by myself. We will try to answer as many questions as possible if there are any. If not, while that is happening, is there anything in addition our panelists would like to share that maybe we didn't touch on that you want to bring to light?
I just wanted to add, as you were talking about our students in special education, that, obviously there's been a lot of talk about dyslexia and having a screener for dyslexia. And it's already been proven through research that having a structured literacy instruction actually supports students with dyslexia, right? So I just think it allows, as the state gets ready to pass, hopefully something that really supports a screener for dyslexia, it's going to push more districts in the direction of actually having to do something to really support the science of reading in their school district. So I just think as more of this happens at the state level, you're going to see more districts actually have to make a shift to be able to support sort of our students and figure out what's best for our students, and not necessarily our own sort of philosophical beliefs around literacy, right? We're going to actually have to really dig into science of reading. And it's already been proven that it supports students who have dyslexia.
Right. And just to kind of echo with what Larisha just mentioned, is I was just actually going to talk about the dyslexia that Governor, when Newsom passed, is moving towards getting that dyslexia screener as part of what we require. It's with the science reading based reading approach, we some of the, I guess, the barring barriers to it is because of a personal investment in the approach in which we've been teaching reading. And then this misunderstanding that phonics is boring and phonics is, this instruction is going to be drill and kill. So it's like cat, C-A-T, cat, and that's all you're going to get. And that's not true about the instruction for foundational skills. And so the getting over that, but also the understanding that the dyslexia screener is actually going to be helpful, not just for identifying kids for dyslexia, but also any kids who might actually have indications for struggling reading. And so that data point helps then for us, because in schools, we want to be able to dial down and to have the assessment to know exactly what skills that the students will still need for instruction too. And so that's, both those things in place, and then making that to be universal for all the schools, that's going to help our students, especially our neurodiverse learners. And one thing I said earlier about our students being curriculum casualties is that we might have some students that are over-identified in special ed because they haven't had the proper instruction. And so I've working with my intervention teachers is that if they had the proper instruction, then they actually would have been, they would have been making the growth that they should have in the first place. So that's addressing that in the tier 1 classroom instruction, that they have the quality instruction in the classroom.
Great. We did have a question come in. I have in the chat here. So the question is, do all students have access to SIPS instruction in West Contra Costa? AKA, are all teachers using SIPS in the relevant grades or classes, or is it just students whose teachers choose to opt in? So I guess that's a good question for you, Larisha.
So it was purchased for all schools. It is still an opt-in process as part of, just sort of trying to put something out there to get us moving in that direction. But it's slowly picked up. So we have probably over 15 to 20 schools now. I don't have the exact number. It started off pretty slow. And so we have over 15, 20 schools that are actually using it, that are actually attending PD, the SIPS PD. A lot of schools have started to see the growth. We actually had 9 focal schools. We have SIPS instruction as tier 1, and then they also now have SIPS additional instruction with academic support providers. In those schools, we've seen a lot of growth in those schools as well, according to iReady. And so I think as people are starting to see the data and see the growth, we're going to have more schools pick up using SIPS. But actually, all schools have it, and all teachers are welcome to any of the SIPS training, and they're offered every month by the literacy department. But it's not necessarily mandatory currently.
Got it. Thanks, Larisha. Another question: how will the proposed changes in literacy pedagogy impact the academic outcomes of African descended district students? So how is it supporting our Black students?
So and this question is that these proposed changes in literacy pedagogy, there's research actually even in the phonemic awareness instruction level, that actually the indicator for success is actually in the level of instruction, the high quality level of instruction, just phonemic awareness. And it bypasses socioeconomic status. So poverty is not an issue, barring the poverty. So it's one of those things where, our marginalized students that are typically what we consider the Matthew effect. What this approach does is that it can narrow that gap because they are getting this instruction that they need. So it's like that, what's good for some is also great for all. And so they would benefit from that instruction as well. But I think that what you're talking about historically is them being identified as not knowing how to read, and because they're struggling, but perhaps it's not the student, it's not the child, but it's the instruction that they've been exposed to and been receiving. And so that's one thing that I would examine first, is how your child is responding to this explicit and systematic instruction. And then having that teacher actually gauge that progress, because the data shouldn't just be like, in the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year. There's also should be data collected on your child's progress throughout in response to the instruction. And so that's something that you can advocate and ask for to see if that's in place for your children to see if they're how they're doing after receiving that science-based instruction.
Got it. We had a couple questions, again, a little more specifically to West Contra Costa. And is it possible to know which schools are using SIPs so families can seek those out? But also, sort of, if it's universally sort of known about the science of reading in these units of study, why are we maybe relying on families to push the district? But it sounds like some of those changes are already being made. But is there a way for families to learn more from the district about where these things are being taught? We know Nystrom has this very strong program, but other schools in West Contra Costa.
Yeah, I don't have all the schools off the top of my head. I'd have to get
Mhm.
a literacy director. So what I can do is pass them off to Natalie, and
Mhm.
Natalie can pass them back on to anyone who was here on Zoom, because I know you have the attendance. But I know, for example, Downer uses SIPs, Bayview, we have Coronado that started up. Stige is using SIPs now. So we have several schools that are using it, but I don't want to take anyone out of the equation. So I will get a comprehensive list to Natalie and then get that back to you. In terms of
Great.
the latter part of the question, which was really around full implementation of SIPs. I think that is part of the literacy task force that's getting ready to occur, is to really start talking about what is every school using. I mean, the director actually went to every school with her team to actually talk about what's being used at their school, because believe it or not, even though the district adopted Readers and Writers Workshop, we have several schools that already use EL education. We have several schools that use other curriculum that's been adopted. And so it's a little bit of a mixture of everything across the board, because there's been a lot of autonomy around making a choice, right? And so I just think, as I've said before, a district with 54 schools, 54 principals, it's just around change management, right? And really having engagement with parents, engagement with the community, engagement with the principals, to really talk about why a shift is needed, and why probably a new literacy adoption is needed, and really having data to support that. So really having some of these SIP schools that are actually doing the work already, Jamie being the pioneer of that, right? Like, we can actually show data around how these schools and students are improving to really, shift the narrative, and get more buy-in to actually make the shift. Because even when you make the shift, you're still going to have parents and you are still going to have community that are not going to want that shift, right? Because you're still going to have parents, as was just mentioned, and community that are going to say, oh, this is just kill and drill, right? Our kids are just going to be sitting getting phonics all day. They're not going to have print rich, text in front of them. They are going to be bored. They are going to be disengaged. And so you have to paint a narrative. You can't just make the shift as a large district like this without being able to tell a story first. So that's kind of where they are. And that's what the task force will be charged with doing for a new literacy option in the coming years. Yep.
I would just add real quickly that I think we often rush to talk about and get excited about and adopt new curriculums without understanding sort of what's behind those curriculums. And so I think before we even get to the point of talking new curriculums, like, we as like a district and leaders and people in the community need to do a whole lot of learning, adult learning, before we can really turn to the kid, focus on the kid learning, because we have to norm ourselves on and learn about how students learn to read and create a common understanding. And I think right now we have a ways to go on that front.
Great. Thank you. All right, I want to thank my panelists. Thank you for sharing your thoughts in this very lively, interesting discussion. I'm going to turn it to Julia Sen from the Oakland Literacy Coalition to share some resources.
Hi, everybody. How's it going? Thank you, everybody, for all of that. That was great. I took a lot of screenshots and notes, and I want to share with you. Let me just pull up my tab so I can share it with you. A resource that we have developed at the Oakland Literacy Coalition. It's called Oakland Reads, and it's a website for families, caregivers, tutors, anybody who works with students outside of school to help support reading at home. And it's based on the science of literacy. So I just want to give you a quick few-minute demo. We heard a lot about the building blocks of reading, Scarborough's reading rope, 5 pillars of literacy. Here, we've broken it down into 8. It's basically still the 5, but we've just broken it down a little more into like letter, like I don't know, what is the like letter knowledge, I think, or and then sight words. So we have a few extra ones. But if you go to the How Reading Works site, you can go to our reading skill overview. And we have a lot of the same information that you've seen here. A simple view of reading, the building blocks, and then the reading skills. So you can click on any one of these skills. And what we tried to do is put it into family-friendly language. These are aligned with the OUSD academic milestones, the literacy milestones, but they're applicable. Those are all based on state standards. So it's applicable for anybody in California. So when you go to, a parent or a family goes to this site, you know, and they can click on any of the reading skills. It has a breakdown of what that reading skill is. So this one's about fluency. There are videos to watch about what, you know, how to help your child at home develop that skill, what it really means, and then activities that they can do at home. So that's sort of one way to explore the site, is through all of those reading skills. The other way to explore the site is going by age or grade. And so you can go to whatever grade we have, a lot, early childhood up to 5th grade. So I'll just like choose 2nd grade, for example. And then we have videos of what reading and writing should look like for that grade level by the end of the year. You know, we find that a lot of families don't know what to expect, and they don't know, you know, we hear often from teachers like, your child's doing fine, they're doing fine, you know, and so we're trying to give families more resources to understand, like, okay, this is what my child should be working towards. And if they're far away from this, then encouraging families to go and speak to the teacher and get help. So there's videos about reading and writing, and then we go down to the literacy milestones. So this is Oakland based, but they all, you know, many of these things, like I said, are based on standards that students need to do across the state. So you can go to any one of these standards. They're broken down by the 3 trimesters, so the 3 report cards. So we do fall by Halloween, winter by Valentine's Day, and spring by spring break. You can go on to any of these and click on it, and it breaks down different literacy milestones. And then you can also go back, click on, for example, phonics, and it will take you back to that reading skill page and give you resources that you can work on. More stuff. We have iReady on there because that's what Oakland uses. Activities, there's videos and explanations. So just wanted to get this out there for you. You know, please feel free to spread the word and share it with families, whether you're in Oakland or not. There's also some videos on the site in the Reading with Children part, and then the resources for concerned families has a lot of stuff about what to do if you're concerned about your child. The process of just asking for help, families' rights, getting an assessment, asking for an assessment, things like that. We're also, I think that we have a slide about a survey. Also providers, we're at the bottom of every page. If you're a provider and not a family, we'd love you to take the provider survey, which is linked to where it says share your feedback. Or if you have a resource that you'd like to share with us, we always love adding more resources to our website. And if you are a family and you take some time and explore the website, we'd love to hear your feedback. So I think Go has a slide with the QR code to get to the survey. And then for the first 50 people that fill out the survey, we'll mail you a $25 gift card. Stop share. Oops, I stopped my video. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And I know we're coming to the end of our time. We're a few minutes over, but I just want to share a few more resources before we wrap up. If you or your child's teacher sees that your child is struggling and might need additional support and intervention, we just published at Go Public Schools a Parent's Guide to Special Education, where you can learn more about individualized education programs or IEPs and navigating special education. While a portion of the guide is tailored specifically for schools and families in West Contra Costa regarding resources, the bulk of it does focus on California, so state level special education laws, guidelines, and rights. And Natalie has already dropped that link in the chat for you to download and check out. It's available in both English and Spanish. As mentioned as well, we created a one-pager to connect you to a handful of additional resources regarding literacy, and those links are also in the chat. And the next question is, so where does this work go from here, right? What are we going to do? We've had these 3 learning sessions. So in the fall, we will continue the learning journey we started this month in May. First, we'll have a Science of Reading intensive series throughout the fall, which will include 6 to 10 learning sessions designed for families for those new to reading instruction. These will all be held virtually and all are welcome to attend. The goal is to support key stakeholders to understand the shifts needed in our classrooms to improve reading outcomes for all children. We will then host school site visits to observe high quality reading instruction in West Contra Costa and in Oakland. There's nothing more powerful than seeing the ideas we are learning about in action. And then in the winter and spring, advocacy will begin through a community-led advocacy effort. A committee of families and community partners will work together to transform reading instruction in West Contra Costa. These meetings will be both in person and virtually. The committee will explore the unique conditions in West Contra Costa USD, identify an advocacy lever to begin to improve reading outcomes for students, and design a campaign and dive into implementation. So we will also be supporting the effort of shifting the instruction in West Contra Costa. Look for a launch email in August that will preview the work for the year to come. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you for our audience. Thank you for everyone for being here tonight, and have a great evening.